The story of the Vietnam War didn't begin as America's nightmare. It began as a mission that seemed simple, even winnable. But what followed became one of the longest, most complex, and psychologically draining wars in modern history. It started in the shadow of the Cold War. The United States believed in the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, others would quickly follow. Vietnam, divided into North and South, became the front line. North Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union and China, while South Vietnam was supported by the US. What looked like a contained conflict quickly spiraled into something much bigger. At first, America didn't send large numbers of troops. Instead, it provided advisors, weapons, and financial support. But by 1965, everything changed. US combat troops began arriving in massive numbers. Within a few years, over 500,000 American soldiers were deployed. The expectation? A quick victory against what seemed like a weaker enemy. But Vietnam wasn't a conventional war. The US military was trained for large-scale battles, clear front lines, and visible enemies. In Vietnam, none of that existed. The Viet Cong, a guerrilla force allied with North Vietnam, blended into the jungle and the civilian population. They struck suddenly, disappeared instantly, and knew the terrain far better than American forces. Dense jungles, hidden tunnels, and brutal climate conditions turned every mission into a deadly gamble. Then came one of the biggest turning points, the Tet Offensive in 1968. Thousands of coordinated attacks were launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across South Vietnam. Militarily, the US eventually pushed them back. But psychologically, it was devastating. Americans watching on television saw chaos, destruction, and a war far from being won, despite years of government assurances. That's when public opinion began to shift. Back home, protests exploded. College campuses, city streets, and even veterans themselves began questioning the war. Graphic media coverage showed the true horrors: burning villages, injured civilians, and body bags returning home. Trust in the government eroded. People started asking, what are we really fighting for? Meanwhile, the war kept dragging on. The US relied heavily on bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, dropping millions of tons of explosives over Vietnam. But instead of breaking the enemy's will, it often strengthened resistance. North Vietnam remained determined, willing to endure massive losses for eventual victory. This difference in mindset became a critical factor. America was fighting to stop communism, but North Vietnam was fighting for national unification and independence. And then there was the issue of leadership. Political leaders in Washington struggled to define a clear path to victory. Military commanders reported progress, but on the ground, soldiers experienced something very different. Territory gained one day could be lost the next. It became a war of attrition, measuring success by body counts rather than strategic wins. For many soldiers, the psychological toll was immense. They faced an invisible enemy, constant fear, and unclear objectives. Morale dropped. Confusion grew. The line between friend and enemy blurred in ways that made every decision life-threatening. By the early 1970s, the US began withdrawing troops under a policy called Vietnamization, shifting responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. But the damage had already been done. The war had stretched over a decade, costing more than 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. In 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The war was over, but the impact didn't end there. The Vietnam War reshaped America's military strategy, foreign policy, and public trust forever. It exposed the limits of military power in unconventional warfare and showed how public opinion can influence the outcome of a conflict. It also left deep scars on veterans, on families, and on an entire generation. So why did it become America's endless nightmare? Because it wasn't just a war fought on the battlefield. It was a war of ideology, perception, and endurance. A war where winning wasn't clearly defined, and losing came slowly, painfully, and publicly. And in the end, it proved one thing. Even the most powerful nation in the world can be trapped in a conflict it doesn't fully understand and can't easily escape.